All right. Thanks so much to everybody joining us tonight. Congressman Israel, we are live.
Well, thank you very much, Natalie. Welcome to the Cornell community in the United States and around the world for this evening's Cornell Institute of Politics and Global Affairs program on navigating international hostage situations. We're very pleased to partner tonight's event with the Richardson Center, which you'll hear about in a moment, also the Cornell School of Industrial Labor Relations. And this evening, we'll welcome Governor Bill Richardson, also Ambassador Bill Richardson, Ambassador Roger Carstens, and a member of Cornell's faculty, Dr. Sabrina Karim. They'll be introduced properly in a moment. For those of you who don't know, the mission of the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs at Cornell is very simple. We deepen discourse and we broaden understanding. We are bipartisan, and our featured guests have been as varied as President Bill Clinton several months ago, and Reince Priebus, who served as Chief of Staff to President Trump. We've also had General H.R. McMaster, the most prominent journalists and authors, members of the Senate, members of the House, ambassadors, and of course tonight's stellar program. For information about the Institute, just Google Cornell Institute of Politics, and that will bring you right to our website. We have several distinguished guests joining us this evening. I want to acknowledge them. Former United States Congressman John Barrow from Georgia is with us, and a member of the Cornell Board of Trustees, Dr. Aryan Shigani, is with us as well. Now to our guests this evening, we're thrilled to have, as I said, a stellar panel, and to provide the introductions for each of our panelists, an equally stellar friend of the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs at Cornell, a member of the Cornell Board of Trustees, Mr. Martin Scheinman. Martin?
Thank you, Congressman. I'm going to read everyone's introductions because I think it's important for everybody to have some details. Governor Bill Richardson has held leadership positions in the private, government, and not-for-profit sectors. From 2010 to present, Governor Richardson has operated the Richardson Center for Global Engagement, a foundation focusing on conflict resolution, prisoner release, and environmental protection. Governor Richardson has more than 30 years of government experience. His latest government position was serving as the two-time governor of New Mexico from 2003 to 2010. Prior to his entry into the private sector, Governor Richardson represented New Mexico in the 3rd Congressional District in the United States Congress for 15 years, and he was appointed by President Clinton to serve as the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations and the Secretary of Energy. As a diplomat and special envoy to the Organization of American States from 2010 to 2016, Governor Richardson successfully won the release of hostages and American servicemen in North Korea, Cuba, Iraq, and the Sudan. Dr. Sabrina Karim is the Hardest Family Faculty Fellow, Assistant Professor in the Department of Government at Cornell University. Her research focuses on state building in the aftermath of political violence. Specifically, she studies police violence and reform in a global context, including international police assistance, gender reforms in peacekeeping and domestic security sectors, and the relationship between gender and political violence. She is currently working on a book manuscript about how domestic politics and international police assistance shape changes in policing, as well as how they affect police violence, and is the author of several titles. Ambassador Roger D. Carstens is the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs in the United States Department of State. Mr. Carstens was the former Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor at the U.S. Department of State, where he oversaw the Bureau's work in the Near Eastern Affairs, Western Hemisphere Affairs, and the Office of Security and Human Rights. Previously, he served in Amman, Jordan as the country director for US-based INGO that provided humanitarian assistance and stability support to Syrian refugees and internally displaced persons. The ambassador is a retired Army Lieutenant Colonel who served in Special Forces and the 1st Ranger Battalion. Now let us start, and let me kick it off. First of all, welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for being here. As the founder of the Scheinman Institute on Conflict Resolution, I have a deep interest in ensuring that students and professionals have the tools and education required to handle disputes and reach resolution. What advice would you give to students that are interested in this field of work? Any of you?
Well, maybe I'll go first since I'm the oldest, Marty, and thanks for the great introduction into Congressman Israel, distinguished member of Congress, great institute that you have at Cornell. This is what I say to the young people that are out there, your students. One, do public service. It's a noble profession. State Department, Foreign Service, anything relating to serving the country is important. Run for office. Number two, when it comes to negotiating conflict resolution, I know we're replete with technology, with Zoom, with Facebook, with Twitter, with WhatsApp, everything. Don't forget personal relationships, meeting people, talking to people, earning their trust. Any kind of negotiation, despite enormous political differences, have that trust. Lastly, I think it's very important that there be a foundation of languages, of history. I know everybody's a techie these days, but don't forget building trust and confidence among human beings. Ambassador Carstens over there has got the ideal combination of a military, academic, a background that also involves negotiating today. Mickey Bergman from my team, who's listening, also has that military diplomatic experience. And I will conclude with Steve Israel, who has built this institute into an outstanding forum to discuss issues and ideas. Be bipartisan. The level of discourse today is terrible. I wish that Steve Israel would go back to the Congress to straighten things out. But Marty, thank you for having me.
Thank you.
That would be a hostage situation, Bill, if I were to go back to Congress. Ambassador?
Anything else? Dr. Karim, would you like to comment about for students about how they get into this field, or anyone else?
I'm happy to do that after the ambassador.
Well, I guess I would say it's hard to top what Governor Richardson said. In my field, he's the master. We study how he did business. We're in a business where there really aren't any real books on how to do this. And so you have to somehow try to divine case studies and examples from watching those who've gone before you. So the only thing I would add from what the governor said is do a lot of reading. It's a chance to actually learn from people who have gone through something, had time to analyze their thoughts and put it down in writing. And I certainly have learned from reading of Governor Richardson's success and some of the people that went before me. So that's all I would add. But Governor Richardson, I think, to my mind, kind of nailed it quite well. Thank you.
I would also echo what the governor said. I think all 3 points are incredibly important. I would just add that I think there's a lot of ways to become involved in public service early on, especially as undergraduates. So a few opportunities include the Pickering Foreign Affairs Fellowship Program, for example, or the Truman Fellowship Program. And then some paths afterwards, include obviously the Foreign Service, as well as perhaps even a Fulbright Fellowship. So those are all entry points that are excellent ways to get into the State Department. Many of my students have pursued a lot of those pathways and have been very successful. But I really, I think one of the most important things that the governor said, though, is the second point about human relationships. I think that's really the key. Relationships are the key to solving any kind of conflict, and that happens at any level. So it's really important to have those interpersonal skills.
Hey, Governor, I want to pick up on something that the ambassador said, that your work in this field has been studied, and you present some case studies. I have two initial questions for you. One is, you were recently involved in a couple of releases from Iran. That is a case study. So I was hoping that you could take us through that. How did that work? Did you work with the government? What worked, what did not work? And then, but let's begin by setting the stage and asking you to explain the work of the Richardson Center and how it operates. So what is the Richardson Center? How does it operate? And then talk about the Iran case that you worked on as a case study.
Well, first, the Richardson Center. We are not a government organization. We're a foundation. We work for families of the detainees and political prisoners. How does it work? They ask us, Mickey Bergman, who's on the Zoom, receives a letter from a family saying, we would appreciate your help in negotiating the release of hostage XYZ. That's the difference. We're an independent organization, but we work for the government. Now, we work with the government. Now, Roger Carstens, as the representative, presidential envoy, is our link when we work for the government, which is almost all of the time. What else do we do? We don't charge. Mickey Bergman, it's a really two-person operation, Steve. It's not like all the staff you have there, you and Marty have at Cornell, or even Dr. Sabrina. So what we do directly is we negotiate with the captors, with the North Koreans, with the Venezuelans. You mentioned Iran. We don't do advocacy. We support all the advocacy groups, but we actually, I was the last negotiation, which is, by the way, not going too well with Venezuela. We've got hostages into house arrest. They've been in prison, 6 Venezuelan Americans. We work very closely with with Roger Carstens. And we're trying to, when you negotiate a hostage, little things are important, like making sure they get medical exams. They have Zoom contact with their families. You don't get their actual release. And sometimes it takes a long time with some of these, President Clinton, you mentioned him. One time he was asked at a press conference, why do you send Richardson to go to these hostage areas with the dictators? He says, well, bad people like Richardson. He said that. I know it's not very funny, but no, Roger, thanks for laughing. But all right, so I'll conclude with this because there's so many other outstanding speakers here that can talk about these issues. My last point is when you negotiate, I think Dr. Sabrina mentioned this. You've got to relate to your negotiating partner or enemy. You've got to relate to them personally and give them credit and find ways to find commonality. A little levity is very important. Reading is very important. History, know what makes them tick. Sometimes it's very difficult, especially with the North Koreans. So I on Iran, I'm sorry, I want to just get to that. We met with the Iranian foreign minister in New York at the General Assembly, and
When was this?
told us what they wanted. Zarif.
When was this?
This was a year and a half ago at the General Assembly. And he told us it was very clear the Iranians wanted prisoner swaps. So we worked with the administration, the State Department. Roger wasn't there, but there was a little bit of a breakdown sometimes when you don't work, without trying to get partisan. There were some in the Trump administration that wanted to take the political credit. Anyway, the important thing is Dr. Wang from Princeton got home. We got another hostage out from Iran working with the Justice Department. But that was about a year and a half ago before the COVID. And everything has slowed down since then.
Okay, thank you. So Ambassador, let's follow up on that. What government entities that deal with, what are the government entities that deal with negotiation cases? Who gets involved? How does it work? And is there anything different? I don't know if it's a political question, but is there anything different from the past? How you would do it now as how maybe what kind of limitations or opportunities did you have in the past that you don't have now?
All right, Marty, thanks for that question. And thanks for that wonderful introduction. I feel bad I didn't bring this up earlier, but I wanted to say thanks to Congressman Israel. Thank you, Governor Richardson, for this invitation. Thanks also to the Cornell Institute of Politics. And it's a pleasure also to be on this panel with Dr. Karim here. Really big honor. It's also a pleasure to talk to the students that are out in the Zoom audience. So I guess I would start by saying that in 2015 or so, the United States was not doing that well in addressing hostage issues and the issues of what we call wrongful detainees. A quick definition for students who may not know: consider a hostage someone that's taken by a terrorist group, for example, and used either as leverage against a country or else to get concessions from either people, i.e. money, or else to get political leverage. A wrongful detainee is kind of like that, except it's a nation state which is taking a US citizen and then using them as a bargaining chip or for political leverage. We weren't doing that well in about 2015. And so President Obama exercised his presidential leadership and pushed out an executive order and also put out a presidential policy declaration that created what we at that point called the hostage enterprise. And there are three entities in the government that consist of this hostage enterprise. One is my office, the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs, or we call it SPIHA because that's such a mouthful. And then there's the Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell that's headquartered over at the FBI. And think of that as an interagency clearinghouse, a task force of about 40 people coming from the Department of Defense, Department of Justice, FBI, CIA, and so on, who work together day in and day out to try to divine information on what the other side is doing, the hostage takers, those who are wrongfully taking American citizens. And then lastly, we have the Hostage Response Group, which really consists of the National Security Council members that convene us and try to provide you could almost say a forum to discuss how we're going to get people back. And so that's what started off, but I'd like to take a quick deviation from your question and say that was initially what we thought of as the hostage recovery enterprise. But I think to the people that do this now, it's much broader than that. It's not just the government. When I think of the hostage recovery enterprise now, I don't necessarily think of this cold, distant government entity. I think of a more vibrant, connected, I guess you could say, forum that's made up of not just the government, but also members of Congress, NGOs, third-party intermediaries, even journalists, because there are journalists out there who really follow this story or these storylines and really try to put this information out there. And most importantly, the families. And that's also a place that I think that we've tried to I guess, tighten the sinews between the government and the people we serve. And that in 2015, I don't think the government did a very good job of communicating what we do to bring people home, communicating that to the families. And I think the families of the people that were held hostage or wrongfully detained sometimes felt like they were left out in the cold. So what do we do in probably 30 seconds or less when someone's determined to be a hostage or a wrongful detainee? It's kind of a full court press, and that the government gets together as an interagency, all those different entities that I mentioned. We reach out to NGOs, we reach out to the family, we reach out to anyone who can to start fashioning a strategy. And usually within about a week or so, we try to go out and visit the family members of those who are wrongfully detained and spend a few hours with them, not only hearing their story, but trying to establish that personal relationship and to give them a sense of how we're going to communicate with them, how we can be transparent, and frankly, how we can partner together to work together to bring their loved one home. But as I always tell them, at the end of the day, you can go to bed knowing that someone else has the responsibility of actually completing that mission of bringing someone home. And while it's the government's job to do that, I have to tell you, as we mentioned earlier, Governor Richardson has an incredible track record of pulling that off in some of the negotiations he has had. And it's been a pleasure to work with people like the governor. The governor mentioned Mickey Bergman. I probably talk to Mickey once or twice a week, usually when I'm heading home at night to bounce an idea off him. And in truth, we chatted for about an hour before we jumped on this Zoom call to try to plot and scheme on how we're going to bring some people back. So it's a vibrant community and it's only getting better, but we're not quite where we need to be. There's still a lot more work to be done to kind of tighten the sinews between all these different groups that are out there.
Thank you. Dr. Karim, let's change a little bit. Your experience and work is coming from an international police assistance background. Do U.S. law enforcement agencies collaborate in training with international agencies? Do they focus on certain countries or certain regions? Can you give us some insight into that?
Yes, let me also just start off by thanking everyone for being here tonight, and particularly to IOPGA for hosting and the Richardson Center for hosting tonight. So it's an honor to be on this panel to talk about these very important issues. So I obviously come from a different background. So I am an academic who studies policing and international police assistance. But I have personally worked with and researched with the police in those particular countries, the Peruvian police, in the police departments in Liberia and Uruguay, and in other countries. And so the experiences and the research that I've done kind of speak to the ways in which U.S. assistance or UN assistance, but today we'll talk about U.S. assistance, has really helped to rebuild those police or engage in reforms in those countries. So I just wanted to take a little bit of a step back to kind of address this issue, because what we really want to consider for this topic tonight is whether or not police departments and law enforcement agencies in other countries have the capacity to deal with these kinds of scenarios. And this is less hostage and more kidnapping, really. But I will, for purposes of tonight, kind of group those within this discussion. So the U.S. Police Assistance Program began very early in 1957 with the Overseas Internal Security Program. And then it kind of morphed into the Agency for International Development, which hosted the International Police Academy, as well as the Office of Public Safety from 1962 to 1974. Now, in 1974, the Congress passed Section 660 of the Foreign Assistance Act, which actually prohibited any kind of police assistance or spending funds on training or advising or equipping foreign law enforcements, with a few exceptions. And that actually still exists to this day. But there have been many ways that the U.S. government has gotten around that. Particularly in the 1980s, we saw an uptick in U.S. police assistance, with pretty strong increase in the 1990s, as well as the Eastern European countries were democratizing. So police assistance became bundled into assistance providing democracy assistance. And then in the 2000s, obviously, with the focus on trying to prevent terrorism, that's when we also saw a rise in police assistance programs in some countries. There is a concentration. So South America and Central America see the majority of police assistance, as well as Southeast Asia. And some sub-Saharan African countries, in particular right now, the Sahel is a major focus for police assistance. So I'll just leave it there for now. I'm happy to talk about what does police assistance entail a little bit later on tonight.
Great. Let me just alert everyone that questions are already coming in, and here's how we're going to handle those questions. In about 15 minutes or so, Natalie is going to interrupt our conversation and tell all of our participants, give you instructions on how to ask a live question. If you prefer not to ask a live question, we'll try and get to any question that you post in the chat room. So we do encourage you to submit your questions. You can raise your hand. Natalie will tell you how to do so if you don't know already, to be recognized for a live question, or simply post it in the chat room. Ambassador, I want to get back to you. I'm curious as to when a case presents itself, and actually Ambassador and Governor Richardson might be able to help on this. When a case presents itself, how do you determine who in the foreign government will be your interlocutor? How do you make that contact? What are the initial steps in navigating a case, not with respect to families, but the government that you're dealing with? Ambassador, you want to start us with that?
Roger, you do that first.
Well, now, Governor, I'm going to turn it over to you very quickly, because you have greatly much more experience than I have in this. I think when we get it, to be honest, we pull together a team of people within this building and without, and we actually go through some network analysis to determine, who are the stakeholders in this case, what are their interests, what's the path that we might take in setting up a negotiation. Who are the people that will not actually be at the negotiating table, but might have influence in a way to work our way up there. And in doing this, you usually do come up with someone, one or two people in the opposite government that might actually seem like the likely target. A good example is there might be a country where the Ministry of Foreign Affairs does not necessarily have all the resident power. And you might instead find yourself dealing with the military or else the intelligence services. Or else you might find yourself dealing with purely the person in charge of the country, that to an extent, it might not matter what the Ministry of Foreign Affairs says or what any of his generals or advisors say. It comes down to the person who's in charge. And even then, there might be a specific path that might give you a better chance of influencing that specific leader. Oftentimes, we look at our allies, trying to determine who might actually provide some influence to, I guess you could say, have an indirect approach to negotiations. So as we start to go through this analysis, I think the question that often comes to mind, two questions. Number one, are you going to try an indirect approach or a direct approach, direct engagement with the government, or indirect through other people or other means? And secondly, how closely do you want this case to be linked to US foreign policy? Do you want, if we have a foreign policy issue with a major country, sometimes it's hard to disassociate the person who's being held hostage with the broader policy issues. Sometimes it's to the advantage of everyone, to include the other country, to find a separate channel to have those discussions. A good example, sometimes nations go to war, and even while they're at war, in another place like Paris, for example, the two countries will meet and start to talk about how to exchange prisoners. But I'll cede my rest of the time to the governor. Sir.
Well, I'm going to answer this and to Steve Israel. Once I answered this in a congressional panel, and I got in a little trouble, but I'm going to be very honest. It's easier to negotiate if you're trying to get a prisoner out, a hostage, an American or whomever, with a dictator, with a person that wields all the power. You know, I've had some success with Saddam Hussein. We got a couple of American contractors out. With Bashir of Sudan, got a journalist named Salopek out. It's usually easier if you've only got one audience and one person with all the power. Now, there's always an intermediary. There's always somebody that you contact. You can't just call Saddam Hussein or Bashir on the phone. Usually it was the ambassador in the country or at the UN and that you first approach as an intermediary. That's always the easiest entity to make that connection. And, you know, Dr. Karim mentioned law enforcement that she deals with. In many cases, especially in Latin America, those law enforcement individuals that are in the police departments, that are in security, that are close to the leadership, those are very important. And I think a good case, and Dr. Karim probably, that's going to be coming up is Mexico. In other words, we've had massive police assistance, DEA assistance with Mexico, but now there's a very nationalistic president who is pushing back and wants more independence. And I will conclude with one hostage, an American Marine that we got out of Mexico on the border because he brought a weapon in, and it was law enforcement and the judicial system that we negotiated to get him out, talking about PTSD. This had been a decorated Marine, and this was an opportunity and an opening with Mexican police and judicial authorities to get him out, saying, you know, Mexico's not at war, PTSD is a casualty of conflict, let this guy out. And that's what we were able to get him out. It was a little bit of also a way that the Mexicans dealt with this issue, which was becoming big in the United States, and in terms of media coverage that was damaging Mexico. And it was a right outcome for this young man who just made a mistake, but deserved to come home, and he came home.
Dr. Karim, can you, I saw you nodding your head when the governor referred to Mexico. Can you expand on some of the unique challenges that we have with respect to Mexico?
Well, so I mean, this comes with one of the challenges that I was going to mention, which is that sometimes countries don't want the US to come in and help with their security forces because the leaders want full control of their security forces. And so if you have an outside actor coming in, there might be some fears that they no longer will maintain that control over the security forces because this assistance is essentially helping to determine who's recruited, what the professional relations standards look like, et cetera. And it's essentially giving more power to the law enforcement agencies, more so sometimes than what the leader would like. But the other reason that I was shaking my head was because what the police assistance programs actually, kind of a side effect of these programs is when you do have US police officers or ex-police officers or contractors that go in, they develop personal relationships with individual officers in those countries, which are invaluable when certain crisis situations might come up. And especially as those same people who've been trained, maybe brought to the US to be trained by the FBI, or maybe, the same person who's been training them, they develop a relationship. And as that person climbs rank, that relationship becomes really important in resolving conflicts.
Marty, before you ask the next questions, I'm just curious. I'd love to understand just the scale of this problem. Are there numbers on how many active hostage situations there are around the world? Anybody have a sense of that?
Roger?
You're on mute, Roger.
On mute there.
Yeah.
I actually do, but sadly, I'm not able to give it. I can pass to you some information from an NGO, and that's the Foley Foundation. Currently numbers that hovering around 45 cases of Americans being held hostage or who have been wrongfully detained. Of course, being in the government, I'd rather not confirm nor deny that number, but the Foley Foundation does do a lot of good work, so they might be pretty close.
Thank you. Marty?
Governor, let me just follow up with this comment about nationalism in a particular country. Are there things that you can do that the US government cannot do? And can there really be collaboration with the government, or frankly, is it too politically motivated once you allow the government to be perceived as your partner?
Well, I think Roger gave a very good explanation. Before 2015, it was all very jumbled and there wasn't much interaction in the executive branch with NGOs. But then I think Obama, and I'll give Trump credit, they created and enforced the fusion cell of all the agencies, the presidential hostage nomination, and with Roger, we work very well, NGOs and the government. But we also, as part of the fusion cell, Marty and Dr. Karim, we assembled academics and former ambassadors to tell us, okay, we have a hostage situation in Iran, in the Philippines. What is the best way? Who are the main actors? How can we make this happen? How can we coordinate better? So I think, Marty, right now the situation is good. There's good cooperation, but there's some cases when the government doesn't want an NGO like mine to deal directly with a country because they don't have a relationship, like in Iraq, like in some cases in North Korea. So sometimes an interlocutor that has some contacts and credibility and has been in the government is helpful.
So we only have a couple of minutes before we're going to turn it over to Natalie, but Ambassador, can you ask us what's working and what can we do better? What needs to be done in terms of providing platforms and the space for you to do your work better? How could government and non-government help?
That's a wonderful question, Marty. Thank you. We're doing a lot better in terms of communication. As I said, I talk to Mickey Bergman once or twice a week. The governors had been wonderful at working because, as the governor intimated, sometimes there's things that he can do that we just in the government cannot. And so to have these relationships, these communications, and have these very open and transparent channels has really, I think, changed the nature of what 5 or 6 years ago just was not functioning that well. So what do we need to do better? Well, frankly, we still need to communicate better. I still think that we, as I said earlier, have to keep tightening those sinews. And the reason why is there's almost a life cycle to when someone gets taken by a country. And it could be for someone taken by a certain country 24 months, another one it might be 36 months. There could be amount of time that a person is going to be gone just due to the fact that he's been taken. And I think we have to keep finding ways to kind of tighten that cycle, to shorten that time, to get to the families quicker and try to find these solutions faster. And frankly, one way is to partner with academia. I am constantly told and cited statistics that have yet to be proven by anyone, because honestly, this is still kind of a new field. I think it's going to be important for us to partner with members in academia to start doing the hard statistical analysis to determine the cause and effect of some of the things that we're dealing with. Because right now, there just isn't that body of scientific research or academic research or what have you.
Let's ask Natalie, if we can, to give instructions on how our participants can pose questions. And then I'm going to pose a question to Dr. Karim while we're waiting for audience participation. Natalie.
Great. So if anybody has a question tonight, you could look towards the bottom of your screen. You'll see the raise hand function. You can go ahead and click on that to queue up if you'd like to ask your question to our panel. If you prefer to write out the questions, you'll see the Q&A function also at the bottom there, and you could type out the questions that I can read to our panelists.
Dr. Karim, we heard from the ambassador on what we need to do better. Your perspective, please. What do you think needs to be done better? Where are there opportunities for improvement?
Yeah, so I think, so when it comes to at least developing the capacity of law enforcement agencies and for them to welcome US police assistance, especially when it comes to hostage crisis training, there's a few things. So the way that police assistance in the US works is actually through private contracting, right? So it's not like we don't send individual police officers to other countries, rather they have to retire or leave their office and go on their own to take these jobs. And so what that actually does is create kind of a hodgepodge in terms of the personnel pool in which there's expertise. So one, when there's a call for police trainers in Liberia, you don't really know who you're going to get. And I've seen evidence of that. And so if there is a particular need for training around hostage situations in particular countries, there's no guarantee that you're going to get somebody necessarily that is an expert in that, that can do that training for the police in the best way possible. So I think that we could probably come up with a more efficient way for police training to take place, especially when it comes to these specialized needs that some countries may need. Another thing that I would just add is that, I think the countries that we're talking about, like Iran and North Korea, these are countries where the government itself takes hostages. But in the instances that I'm kind of more thinking about where other actors might take people hostage and the government is actually in collaboration with the US in terms of getting those hostages released or those kidnapped victims released. These are countries where policing capacity is really low, or law enforcement capacity is really low. And so when there isn't even basic training, it's really hard to sometimes provide really specialized training when they don't even have the basics or understand the basics of law enforcement. And so I think, building capacity is a very broad term, but I think there's more potential for it and potentially more efficient ways to go forward.
Thank you. Natalie, why don't you unmute our first question, please?
Of course. So our first question comes from Charles Trammell. If you could just go ahead and hit the unmute, you've been allowed to speak and you can ask a question.
Hi there. Thank you for your service, by the way. I was just curious, to what extent do international organizations such as the World Court or Interpol or things like that have a jurisdiction in these types of negotiations? And then also, what if the hostage isn't a person, but something along the lines of what we saw a couple of weeks ago with the pipeline thing, like a cyber hostage?
Well, Charles, I'll take the first shot. One, usually, Charles, these international organizations don't have much of a role. They make appeals, and it's useful to get their backing. The International Court sometimes is a point of leverage. You go to a dictator, you go to a person that has a lot of political prisoners, you say, you know, you're about to be indicted from the International Court. That does have an impact. The UN, the Organization of American States, others, they have an impact, but it's usually bilateral, Charles. Usually political prisoners, hostages are used as bargaining chips. The government, usually on the other side that has the hostage, wants something in return, either another prisoner, or they want to build a better relationship with the United States for PR reasons, or they want humanitarian assistance. You know, for instance, with North Korea, my foundation, Mickey was involved in this. We provided some wheelchairs. You can, under sanctions, provide certain humanitarian assistance to North Korea, a very poor country. And that helped us to move forward on some hostage negotiations. And the North Koreans, they're very open. They will take a hostage and they'll say, you know, we want something in return, so do this. Some countries are very explicit about what they want in return.
Thank you. Our next question will come from a written question from Dr. Shigani, asking, how is a hostage prioritized for release over other hostages in the same country during a prisoner exchange?
Well, you're going to get us in trouble, so I'll let Ambassador Carstens. Well, you know, look, I'm being facetious, but I'm just talking about Americans. Every American hostage is important. Every human being that is detained, we should always try to get out, just like our servicemen. You know, you don't leave them behind. That's a fundamental policy of the United States. Secondly, we don't pay ransom. We don't pay, you know, we don't do that. That doesn't work because that'll increase the number of hostage cases. And then my last point here is that I do think in the Biden administration, I said Trump, Obama, the issue of bringing back these hostages has increased. It's gotten better. In the past, it was not a major factor in our foreign policy. I mean, Congressman Israel and Marty, you remember, I mean, conflict resolution, hostages were taken, the Iran in 1979. It just, so my point is that this has become not the fundamental factor, but a key ingredient in a bilateral relationship that is good. Now, my last point, families are very important of hostages. In the past, they were neglected. Now, Roger says he goes, visits them. They want to know what's going on. They deserve some kind of explanation of what's happening. There are 2 Green Berets in Venezuela now. Everybody's concentrated on the Citgo 6, but there are 2 Green Berets and another young man that were kind of tricked into going to Venezuela that we're trying to get out, and they're forgotten. So it's important that we not forget these hostages.
Thank you. Our next question is for Dr. Karim. Andrew is asking in the chat, for certain police assistance programs, such as the all-female Afghan uniformed police units, what types of enduring relationships might be most helpful in the intersectional communication of state-held prisoners? Should the USA continue some kind of person-to-person or organizational level historical standing relationships with these types of units, even after troop drawdowns?
Yeah, so I don't think that these two options are mutually exclusive. I think the goal of any kind of program is to try to develop a country-to-country relationship of some sort, but that doesn't exclude the fact that there are also personal relationships that are developed at the same time because of the people that are seconded there or the trainers that go over to the countries. You know, the case of Afghanistan that's brought up in this example, is an interesting one. The US has played a major role in rebuilding the police force and military in Afghanistan. And so the question is, what happens now with the drawdown? Do those relationships maintain? If so, how? This is a whole nother panel we could discuss about what to do with Afghanistan. But I think if there are ways to maintain those relationships, that would be ideal. In a situation where you're negotiating with the Taliban, that country to country relationship becomes a little bit more tricky because of the political situation. But I would hope that those personal relationships are maintained.
Hadley, let me, if I may, read a question that's been posed by Jim. The question is, I worked for ICATAP, International Criminal Investigative Assistance Program, in both Pakistan and Indonesia. I'm a 25-year local police hostage negotiator and was hired by the feds to specifically train and form HNT teams in both those countries, 2006 to 2008 in Pakistan, and then 2011, 2012 in Bosnia. Is this still happening at the operational level in developing countries? Any response to that?
Well, I believe, Steve, that AID, the Agency for International Development, some of the law enforcement operations, the FBI, they're internationalizing DEA, a lot of their operations. So I think the answer to that very good question is yes. And I think it's good. Dr. Karim is the expert in training law enforcement overseas, but I think if you help on issues relating to training and rooting out corruption. And, by the way, I didn't answer that young man's question about the hostage situation with pipelines. I mean, this is an area that we're totally unprepared how to handle, especially with our infrastructure and our grid. How do you deal with these cyber problems? And this is something that internationally, I think many of these law enforcement organizations in Indonesia, where this gentleman posed the training, is becoming an issue. And we have to, on our own, find a way to deal with these new threats that may not involve people, but involve our infrastructure, our institutions, our grid that we're not prepared for.
Dr. Karim, may I ask, just to follow up on that, is it sensible for us to broaden the capacity for hostage negotiators by tapping into the skills and organizing the talents of people who have been trained as police hostage negotiating, forming police hostage negotiating teams? Should people like Jim be brought into this process on a more serious basis?
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes back to the problem that I mentioned, that the way in which police assistance is done is essentially privatized, right? It's a contract, and so that, like I said, that doesn't necessarily mean that we get people like Jim who have this expert. Sorry, that's his name, right? Sorry, sorry, Jim, who have this expertise simply because maybe they're not available or they haven't applied for this particular position. And so other people that maybe, fit the bill, but don't have that particular expertise are the ones that get sent over. So I think, I think if we're serious about training and using the best people that we have to train, then I think there could be potentially a more efficient way to get those people to be the ones that are training the law enforcement agents, officers in other countries. And I'll just really quickly add that, when the US does engage in police assistance, the majority of it is in operations. But the operations that's prioritized are riot control and counterinsurgency intelligence gathering, and increasingly, SWAT teams, the training SWAT teams that, obviously are trained in situations, barricaded subjects, et cetera. But this particular hostage situation crisis, I think is not necessarily always a part of that.
Ambassador, I see another question that is actually close to my heart because I worked on this when I served on the Armed Services Committee. What roles do language and cultural fluency play in these sorts of crises? Governor Richardson mentioned how important it is for students to have language skills, but how are these types of skills employed during a crisis and by whom?
That is a great question. So my answer would be the cultural fluency and the language. I would almost say that language is a great starting point regardless, because whether you speak German, but you're going to conduct a negotiation in a country that has more of an Arabic flair to it, the fact that you've learned another language, I think, starts to get you to think about how you relate to other people in a culture that's not exactly yours. And the 2 or 3 languages that I pretend to speak have helped me going to countries where I'm actually not even conducting a conversation in that language, but working through a translator or working to find those different skill sets, whether it's body language or whether it's showing respect or whether it's trying to, as the governor pointed, taking extra pains to understand the cultural nuances so that I don't offend anyone, that I'm able to show respect, even for a tough audience. If you're talking to a pretty tough crowd, I'll use Syria for example, you still want to go in and show proper respect and for both the culture and the people that you're engaging with. And I think the language is always a good start. In the negotiations that I've had, I've worked through translators. Thankfully, I've always had some very good ones who could pretty much do simultaneous translation. But even then, you're still trying to ensure that you're very clear in your communications, because these are discussions where a few words to the left or right and your negotiation starts to go askew, or the other side takes the wrong message back. So we have to be very clear on what we're saying. And it also has to be done in a way that's, I would say, I don't want to say you talk slowly, but you're very measured. And as the governor said, it's never a bad thing, even though you're being measured and trying to watch your words, to throw some levity in there and try to actually get that relationship going. I tell you what, one thing that's just a part of the skill set, whether it's language or not, you've got to bring some compassion and empathy to the game, or else it's going to be an awkward conversation. This is not a place to be cold and robotic. I hope I answered that question.
I think you did just fine. We have just a few more minutes. Natalie, let's get some more questions in.
Great. We have a question from Maria, who is curious, asking our panel about what might be the biggest challenges to negotiate with hybrid regimes like Venezuela.
Well, I'm going to start with that because I'm in the process of that. It's Mickey Bergman and Roger's helping us. With Venezuela, it's helped that my first language was Spanish. So I negotiated in Spanish with President Maduro, with his vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, with Jorge, the head of the assembly. There are interlocutors. We do it all in Spanish. We've had mild success. I'm not saying it's succeeded, but they have moved them into house arrest. So that language always helped me. For instance, in some hostages we got out in Cuba with Fidel Castro. I'm that old that I negotiated with him. Baseball was a commonality that Castro and I had. I was a former baseball player, not very good, but we connected on that. I'll mention one thing, Mickey Bergman, who's listening. Levity is important. Sometimes you gamble in trying to connect with somebody. There was one country, a very bad person that I was negotiating with, and I started out saying, well, where do you keep the dungeons where you take the fingernails off? And the person negotiating with that I was with, I thought was either going to kill me or he was going to laugh. He laughed, thankfully, but Mickey Bergman, who's his face turned red, he thought we were both done. But sometimes that levity, that personal connection that you try to establish, you gamble. Anyway, we did do well in that negotiation eventually. My last point, I made a mistake, Dr. Karim, because you know these issues. Culturally, I was negotiating with Saddam Hussein. I showed him the sole of my shoe, which was dirty. And in an Arab country, that's a terrible mistake. And Saddam Hussein left the room, and I thought we were done in more ways than one. Anyway, he did come back because he basically wanted to make a deal, but that was not a good start. So that cultural connection, Marty, you know those are very important in conflict resolution, especially in certain regions of the world.
Dr. Karim, perspective on Venezuela?
I think this goes back to something that the governor mentioned early on, which was that you mentioned that it was much easier to negotiate when it's one dictator, and in hybrid regimes, there might be lots of points of power. There's a lot of politics going on. Let's just put it that way, where you might not necessarily know who holds the key to the negotiation because there's a lot of actors involved, and not necessarily just one person who you just negotiate with. So knowing the politics, I think, becomes a lot more tricky in identifying the key people that can make the decisions.
Very good. Marty, we only have a few minutes left, maybe 3 minutes left, and I actually have a question for you, if I may. You are considered to be one of the most prominent arbitrators in the country. This is your life. We've heard different perspectives on what you need to, quote, bring to the game. As somebody who mediates, as somebody who is so deeply involved in conflict resolution, what do you think are the key skills that are necessary to negotiate a resolution to any conflict, whether it's a hostage conflict or a labor arbitration?
Well, obviously I didn't know what our panel was going to say, and all I could think about was this is what I do every day, but it's just a different topic and the like. Empathy, being able to understand that it takes a lot for someone to come to the table. You need to, even just that, that person who agrees to engage with the governor has got to deal with his or her own politics, just actually being present. And so it is often the case in what I do. I do discrimination cases, I do labor negotiations. That's what I do. Like baseball, I'm the arbitrator in baseball now. So, we relate to that. And so what I would say is, I always tell people, understand that person took a risk already. And so you need to be able to let that person understand that you hear them, understand what they're going through, and that you admire them. You don't have to, I don't admire a dictator, but I do, that dictator could have also, and the fact that he or she wants something is something that I'm going to try to figure out what it is. So I think that's very similar in what we do. The other component that's very similar is that it is often the case that your person who's at the table is not really the power person. And you need to just figure out that who this person, who do you report to? Take me to your leader. And knowing that you're not going to get to the leader, but you have to be able to imagine what that person wants and how this person who you're speaking to is probably under some pressure to get something for the leader, because otherwise their career or their life is going to be diminished in some way. So I think it's very similar, Steve. It's interesting to say it. The only comment I was going to make, if I could, which I thought was interesting, Governor, is about this ransomware. You said we don't pay ransom, and I'm thinking to myself, how are you going to answer that when people say, well, you pay to turn on your gas line, you won't pay to save this person's life? I imagine this is going to make your lives all more complex.
Yeah.
Good way to end. Maybe our participants can comment on that. Governor, you first.
Oh, look, Marty's right. The reports are we paid the Dominion paid $5 million to get the ransomers off their back and power back. And he said, we did this for our customers, which is probably the case, but we're not prepared for that. We need to have a policy on how we respond to these growing threats. And we don't have it. And Marty's right. I mean, this is an inconsistency. He caught me in a mistake, but it wasn't a person. It was a pipeline. So,
Ambassador, is there a moral hazard to paying ransom?
I would say yes. I mean, it's something you have to weigh. Obviously, we have a policy of not paying ransom, a no concessions policy. I know that's very hard when you talk to the families and realize that, number one, there's a human element to this. Mm-hmm. Number two, these people that are being held as leverage against the United States, which I think increases the level of the government's duty to do something. And yet, if you can't pay that ransom, what more interesting ways can you find to perhaps get that deal? And that's kind of the art of these negotiations.
Dr. Karim, we're going to give you the final word, your perspective.
That's a lot of pressure. No, I think, in the end, it all comes down to bargaining. right? And who can gain more leverage in what way? And so a lot of that has to do with getting as much information as possible about the situation. I think a lot of people might think that paying ransom signals a position of weakness, right? And that's probably the last thing that the United States wants to do.
Governor Richardson, for those who want more information about the Richardson Center, how do they contact you?
Well, the best way, since I'm old fashioned, my phone number, 505-988-7140, and then the email, governor.richardson@gmail.com. And I think on your posting, you have our Richardson Center. So any of those ways. Actually, if you have a problem, call my staff, Mickey Bergman. He's the only one that works for me anyway. And Brooke Lang, who had a lot to do with setting this up with your excellent team, Congressman Israel and Natalie and Marty. I really enjoyed this. This is good.
Well, thank you so much for participating. Governor Bill Richardson, Ambassador Carstens, thank you for your service and your leadership. And of course, Cornell's own Dr. Sabrina Karim, thank you for everything that you do. For more information about this topic, you can contact the Institute. Again, Google Institute of Politics Cornell, and you'll be able to send us a message. We can link you up with the professor, the ambassador, the governor, with Marty Scheinman, and you'll also be able to understand what future programs we have, our various activities. I want to thank everybody again for really an illuminating topic. Thanks, everybody. Be safe. So long.
Thank you.
Thank you.